The talk is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for having me here. Indeed, I have not a commodity specialization. I have looked at many value chains, and I think that is now, after so many years of VCA4D, is one of the interesting aspects that we get information on many different value chains. And we looked at those value chains from the perspective of farm stratification and segmentation, market segmentation. This is done together with Ruud Ruben. He will present right after, more in the midstream. So I hope the two presentations are kind of aligned. Next slide, please. So Ruud and I were motivated to write this paper because we see that in development policy targeted towards sub-Saharan Africa, there is a focus on smallholders, which is rightly so. It's justified because there's so many. Most farmers in sub-Saharan Africa are still smallholder farmers. But still, we have to acknowledge there's much variation between value chains in farm size structures. And that recently, in the past decades, there has been a rise of mid-size and large-scale farmers. And so far, there's been very little research on understanding this, and this VCA4D studies really provide us with a material to look between value chains to understand a bit more why there are certain farm-size structures and what does that imply for agricultural transformation, rural development. Next slide, please. So the materials we use come from 8 studies. We chose a high variety of studies and commodities. We look at green beans in Kenya, maize in Zambia, Nigeria, sorghum in Ghana, groundnut in Ghana, cocoa in Cameroon, cotton in Ethiopia, and aquaculture in Zambia. So that's a very high diversity of commodities or products. And what we really used was the farm topology that was developed by each of these studies. And that contained an idea on how big each of the farm types were. And we defined small scale as less than 3 hectares, medium scale as between 3 and 20 hectares, and large scale from 20 hectares onwards. And there was an idea on how many of those farmers were constituting the agri-food sector. My face is on some of the numbers, but you can trust me that you find, or the studies find, that these agri-food sectors are very much dominated by smallholders. The lowest number is 97% of the number of farmers are less than 3 hectares. So that's what we find here as well. So next slide, please. However, then when we look at volumes, the picture changes. So when we look at crops like Ghana, sorghum in Ghana, groundnut in Ghana, cocoa in Cameroon, we still see a dominance of farmers contributing to most of the volumes produced in this sector. But then moving on towards maize to a lesser extent, but then Nigeria, maize in Zambia to a lesser extent, but particularly maize in Nigeria and green beans in Kenya, we see a much more bimodal system whereby medium scale and even large scale farmers are increasingly more important in delivering the volumes that are produced within those agri-food systems. And then moving to Ethiopia, where we have the cotton value chain, and aquaculture in Zambia, where we see a dominance of large-scale farms in terms of market volumes, contributions to market volumes. And so these are very few farms, very large farms, contributing to a large proportion of all the products being produced there. Next slide, please. This is another way to depict the inequality within these sectors. So we use these typologies to develop these inequality curves. On the horizontal axis, we have the farm population, which is cumulative, and then the contribution to the total production value. And so the dotted line is an equal distribution, and anything that is convex means there is some inequality, and the more convex the curve is, the more inequality. And so here we see that the groundnut, for example, is a very much an equal farm size distribution, but that other crops like cotton have a much less, much more convex curve and are much less unequal. And based on these figures, we can calculate Gini coefficients to have one number for the inequality in the farm size distribution, which we use in the rest of the presentation. Next slide, please. Not only in terms of volumes produced, but we also see a bifurcation, let's say, in terms of the value chains served or the markets served, where small scale farmers still produce a lot for their own consumption in many of the value chains. Not obviously even in cotton we see that. When they sell mostly to the domestic local markets, while medium and large scale farmers almost exclusively, or for a very large extent, sell to processors, exporters, industry. Like, let's say, more remunerative markets with higher standards, higher prices. And that's also what you see, they earn higher prices. Next slide, please. So obviously this is cross-sectional data. We cannot say, okay, what drives these different farm size distributions? So this is really exploratory work. But what we do see is that these Gini coefficients, which are on the horizontal axis and illustrate inequality, are also related with the factor use. We see more capital use in value chains with higher inequality, more large-scale farmers, more medium-scale farmers. Less capital in more equal value chains, and also in terms of labor intensity, we see a negative relationship. So less labor intensity, so less labor needed to produce a certain amount of what we call the value added. In terms of input use, these are intermediate goods and services. There's a negative relationship, which is a bit puzzling to us. I would like to hear your input on that. But it might be related by the fact, by how we are calculating this, which is the expenses on the intermediate goods and services divided by the value added created. So if you have a larger value added created, then you have less intermediate goods and services input use as a ratio. So that might be, but I would like to hear your opinion on that. Next slide. So these were kind of factor use inputs, but also when we look at further down the value chain, the midstream, we see there's a clear relationship between the midstream value added share, which is on the vertical axis. And Ruud will tell a bit more about this and how this is calculated in his presentation. But what we see is that more equal the farm size distribution, the higher the midstream value added share, which means that the midstream is taking more value added than the farm size, than the agricultural sector. And so and the more unequal, the more of the value added as a percentage goes to agriculture and not to the midstream. And this can be related to things like bargaining power, but also efficiency. Next slide, please. So we're coming to our implications for transformation. So we already said there's increasing, from other studies, we know that mid-size and large-scale farmers are increasingly more important for the marketed volume, in terms of marketed volume. What does that mean for agricultural transformation? What we find in the VCA4D studies is that the relationship between land productivity and farm size is very much commodity specific. So we find there's a negative relationship in cotton and cocoa, positive one in aquaculture, sorghum and maize, and in reverse U relationship in green beans, which means the medium scale farmers are more productive than the larger and the small scale farmers. And so when we zoom out, what do we see is that what do we expect is that this trend towards medium and large scale farmers is changing the factor intensity. So the more capital use relatively, less labor use relative to volumes or production value. We see a change in productivity. Other studies like from Tom Jane find that in general, those sectors that move towards medium and larger farms are becoming more productive, but we see that that might, in our case, also be very much commodity specific. We see that emergence of large-scale farms often happens where there's also more remunerative market outlets, export markets, processing. We see more bargaining power for agriculture in those sectors where there's more medium and large-scale farms. And we see a shift from self-employment to wage labor. Next slide, please. So what does it mean for the smallholder, which is still, of course, the majority of the producers are smallholders. There's a mix of effects. It's really hard to pinpoint that down. And it really is probably very much commodity and region specific. But there is a potential for technological spillovers through more developed midstream sectors, but also through direct knowledge spillovers from large to small scale farmers, either intentionally through collaboration, but also through demonstration effects. We see increased competition. Also, the literature shows that particularly on those markets that are increasingly increasing their standards on what products and production should look like. There sometimes smallholders are excluded in favor of more medium and large scale farms. So there's more competition. And then the land markets, mid-size and large-scale farms might emerge from non-local entrants, resulting in increased demand and increased prices for land, which, if you're stepping out of agriculture, is a good thing, I guess, because you can sell your land for more. But if you want to scale up yourself, it becomes more difficult. So to sum it up, moving towards this more unequal farm size distribution seems to be going hand in hand with agricultural transformation, seems to be a feature of this, also of structural transformation, moving out of agriculture, moving into labor, but is obviously disruptive. So we were asked to give some policy implications. Last slide, please. I think it's very important to understand that of agricultural transformation, the rural development, the things that we like to achieve often goes hand in hand with changing farm size distributions, with more medium and large scale farmers. I think that's a very good starting point. And I think that if that is a feature that we should not stop medium and large scale farmers for emerging, but actually stimulate that and reinforce their positive effects. So you can stimulate it by improving your land markets, such that medium and large scale farms can actually emerge, but also stimulate the emergence of more remunerative markets, high standard markets, by stimulating trade and FDI in non-farm sectors and the agri-food chain, and then stimulating these technological spillovers that might exist. At the same time, you need to take into account these disruptive effects for the existing smallholders that might move into labor. So labor and working conditions are becoming more important, living wage. And I think if there's an agricultural transformation, you see more market opportunities. It's important that we help those farmers to also benefit from those things and help them meet the standards of buyers through quality and productivity pushes, but also market linkages, value chain development type of interventions. And finally, there's always smallholders falling through the cracks, coming into a worse situation that they have been before, and those should be taken care of, obviously, through social safety nets if possible. But that's also a feature of structural transformation that some people might not immediately benefit from this, and we need to acknowledge that. So thanks a lot.